Vietnam's story does not begin with emperors, battles, or colonizers. It begins in the soil itself, in the winding rivers and fertile deltas of what we now call the Red River Valley, where human settlements emerged thousands of years ago. Long before dynasties would rise and fall, long before Chinese armies would march across its plains, and long before the bronze and steel of modern warfare reshaped its landscape, there was a civilization that would lay the foundations of a culture that refused to be erased. This was the Dong Sun civilization, a society whose legacy would echo across millennia, not through the roar of conquests, but through the hum of bronze drums, the steady rhythm of rice paddies, and the enduring pulse of a people intimately tied to their land. The Dong Sun culture, flourishing around 1000 BCE to 100 CE, represents the apex of prehistoric Vietnam. Its achievements were not merely technical, but emblematic of a society acutely aware of its environment, its traditions, and its communal obligations. These people were farmers, yes, but they were farmers of exceptional sophistication. They engineered intricate irrigation systems to control the flooding of the Red River, ensuring fertile soil would nourish the crops that fed entire villages. Wet rice agriculture was not just an economic activity. It was the axis around which social and political life revolved. Fields of rice dictated the rhythm of seasons, the cycle of festivals, and the very structure of village life. Families and communities worked together, maintaining dikes and canals, pooling labor and resources in a way that would define Vietnamese communal organization for centuries to come. But to reduce the Dong Sun civilization to mere agrarians would be to overlook the artistry and ingenuity that distinguished them. Their bronze work, particularly the ceremonial drums for which they are famous, reveals a people with a profound sense of ritual, identity, and storytelling. These drums, some weighing over 100 kilograms, were not simply musical instruments. They were repositories of knowledge, symbols of authority, and markers of social cohesion. Decorated with intricate scenes of warriors, boats, animals, and daily life, the drums encoded the values and myths of their society. They told stories of triumph and ceremony, of seasonal rituals, and perhaps even of the distant memory of conflicts and alliances. In a sense, each drum was a chronicle, a means by which history was preserved long before writing systems arrived in the region. The people of Dong Sun were not isolated. Their material culture shows evidence of trade and contact with other Southeast Asian societies, suggesting that even in these early ages, Vietnam was not a passive space, but an active participant in broader regional dynamics. Tools and weapons fashioned from bronze were often distributed across villages, reinforcing networks of exchange, alliances, and influence. This civilization was acutely aware of its place in the environment and in the wider world, balancing internal cohesion with external interaction. The society's technological mastery allowed them to produce not just everyday objects, but tools of warfare and prestige axes, spearheads, and ritual objects, all cast with precision that would astonish later generations. The presence of sharp, standardized weaponry indicates that these communities understood not only agriculture but also defense, community organization, and the subtle art of projecting power. Yet, the genius of the Dong Sun civilization was not confined to material production. Their social structures were remarkably sophisticated for the era. Villages were organized in ways that promoted cooperation and shared responsibility. Leadership often arose from merit or ritual authority, with elders guiding communal decisions while religious figures oversaw ceremonial observances. This balance of political and spiritual leadership reinforced cohesion, creating a society that could withstand environmental challenges, internal disputes, and the occasional external incursion. In many ways, the resilience of Vietnam's people began here, in the interplay between community, labor, and ritual. Religion and belief were woven into the fabric of daily life. Animism, ancestor worship, and early shamanistic practices guided decisions from agriculture to warfare. The rhythm of planting and harvesting was synchronized with ritual calendars, and festivals celebrated the abundance of the land or the bravery of warriors. The bronze drums themselves played a central role in these ceremonies, their resonant tones calling communities together, affirming social hierarchies, and connecting the living to the spirits of ancestors. Here, in these early spiritual practices, we see the first traces of a distinctly Vietnamese worldview, one that would survive conquest, colonization, and war, a belief in the interconnection of people, land, and history. The Dong Sun civilization also laid the groundwork for language and communication. Though written scripts would arrive much later, the complex iconography on their artifacts indicates an early development of symbolic communication. The images carved into bronze drums were not arbitrary. They conveyed meaning, marking identity, achievement, and perhaps legal or ritual codes. Through these symbols, a society without writing maintained cohesion, transmitted knowledge, and codified values, a culture already sophisticated in governance, communication, and social order. Geography played an instrumental role in shaping this society. The Red River Delta, with its periodic floods and fertile soils, demanded ingenuity. Flooding could bring destruction as quickly as it brought fertility, and communities learned to harness this duality. Dikes, canals, and terraces transformed the land into an intricate network of productive fields, creating a landscape where human ingenuity met natural abundance. This intimate relationship with the land would define Vietnamese civilization for millennia, producing a people attuned to cycles, resilience, and adaptation. The significance of the Dong Sun civilization extends beyond agriculture, metallurgy, and ritual. It lies in its legacy of resilience, a quality that would define Vietnam for thousands of years. These early communities cultivated not just crops but cohesion. They forged identities capable of surviving incursions, natural disasters, and the later waves of foreign domination. They proved that survival was as much about culture, ritual, and social organization as it was about weapons or walls. In a sense, the story of Vietnam begins here, not with the fall of empires, but with the rise of a people who could endure, innovate, and flourish in a challenging environment. Trade and interaction further enriched their society. Archaeological evidence indicates the presence of tools and ornaments from distant regions, suggesting that Dong Sun Vietnam was part of an intricate network of cultural and economic exchange across Southeast Asia. Such interactions facilitated the diffusion of ideas, technologies, and artistic motifs, strengthening the civilization's adaptability. The ability to absorb and integrate external influences without losing a sense of identity would become a hallmark of Vietnamese culture, visible centuries later during periods of foreign rule and colonization. Warfare, though not the defining feature of this early period, was nevertheless present. The production of weapons, fortifications, and strategic settlements indicates a society aware of potential threats. But unlike later eras defined by conquest, these conflicts were localized, often defensive, and intertwined with social ritual. Military skill was celebrated alongside agricultural success and ritual proficiency, reflecting a balanced society in which multiple forms of achievement conferred status and authority. The end of the Dong Sun period did not mark a collapse, but rather a transformation. As societies evolved, new technologies, cultural practices, and governance structures were built upon the foundations laid by these early people. Bronze drums ceased to be the central markers of power, yet the organizational principles, agricultural mastery, and spiritual depth persisted. These legacies provided a blueprint for the centuries to come, influencing subsequent dynasties, shaping resistance to foreign domination, and embedding a durable Vietnamese identity that would endure the tests of history. The Dong Sun civilization, then was not merely a prehistoric culture. It was a society that articulated the core values that would define Vietnam: resilience, ingenuity, community, and a deep connection to the land. It teaches that culture is survival, that identity is forged in both labor and ritual, and that even without written history, a people can leave an indelible mark on time itself. When later dynasties, invaders, and colonial powers arrived, they encountered not an empty land, but a civilization with centuries of accumulated knowledge. Skill and identity, a civilization that would resist, adapt, and survive long after its bronze drums fell silent. In understanding Dong Son Vietnam, we begin to understand the Vietnamese story itself, a story not merely of kings and wars, but of human adaptation, cultural continuity, and the enduring power of society to shape its destiny. It is a story that will echo through the centuries, through conquest and rebellion, through colonial impositions and modern transformation. From these first villages and bronze drums, the rhythm of Vietnamese history begins, a rhythm of resilience, ingenuity, and identity that continues to this day. The story of Vietnam takes a dramatic turn in 111 BCE, when the Han Dynasty of China, a force defined by its military might and administrative precision, extended its dominion southward into the lands of the Red River Delta. The armies of Emperor Wu marched into what is now northern Vietnam, not merely as conquerors, but as instruments of imperial bureaucracy, intent on integrating the region into the vast machinery of the Han state. For the people of early Vietnam, this marked the beginning of the Northern Domination period, a stretch of more than 9 centuries in which the region would be pulled into the orbit of Chinese political, cultural, and technological influence, yet never fully surrendering its identity. The imposition of Han rule was swift and methodical. Chinese administrators introduced Confucian principles of governance, codifying laws, structuring bureaucracies, and establishing taxation systems that penetrated even the most remote villages. Local chieftains were replaced by appointed officials, often foreigners, whose primary allegiance was to distant imperial centers. Roads, canals, and settlements were constructed with the precision of the Han, linking the delta to the broader empire. Trade routes opened, bringing goods, ideas, and technologies that would reshape local economies. Yet, even as Chinese culture permeated, the Vietnamese people found ways to adapt, resist, and preserve their own traditions. Resistance began almost immediately. The region's rivers and mountains, its dense forests and hidden valleys, became sanctuaries for those unwilling to submit. Among the earliest and most celebrated of these resistances were the Trung sisters, Trung Trak and Trung Ni. In 40 CE, they raised an army of thousands, rallying local chieftains and villagers alike in revolt against Han authority. Their campaign briefly liberated key territories, reinstating Vietnamese governance and asserting local control over the Delta. Yet the rebellion was ultimately crushed by superior Han forces. The sisters, rather than surrender, chose to die by their own hands, a final act of defiance that would echo through history. Their story was not merely a tale of military resistance. It became a symbol of national identity, of courage, and of the enduring will to assert autonomy in the face of overwhelming foreign power. The Northern Domination period was not a static occupation. It was an era of constant negotiation between imposition and adaptation. While the Chinese introduced Confucian governance and bureaucratic structures, local Vietnamese leaders found ways to preserve indigenous customs, oral histories, and social hierarchies. Villages remained centers of local autonomy, their elders mediating disputes and maintaining traditions. Agricultural practices, though enhanced by Chinese techniques, retained distinctly Vietnamese methods of water management and rice cultivation. Religious and spiritual life, ancestor worship, animism, and shamanistic rituals persisted alongside imported philosophies. This delicate balance between adaptation and resistance became a defining feature of Vietnamese civilization. Chinese influence was profound, but not absolute. Han and subsequent dynasties introduced paper, coinage, administrative methods, and military strategies that the Vietnamese would selectively adopt. Writing systems arrived, initially for administrative purposes, allowing local elites to document land holdings, taxes, and legal matters. Confucian ideals, emphasizing hierarchy, filial piety, and social responsibility, were taught in schools established in key urban centers. Yet these innovations were assimilated into an already complex societal fabric. Vietnamese villages continued to operate through communal consensus, balancing the external demands of imperial authority with local needs. The era saw intermittent rebellions beyond the Trung Sisters' revolt, each demonstrating the persistence of Vietnamese agency. Figures such as Lady True, in the 3rd century CE, would later mount her own rebellion, famously leading an army against the Eastern Wu dynasty's forces. These uprisings were often fueled by grievances over taxation, conscription, or interference in local governance, but they were also deeply symbolic, acts of cultural preservation, affirming the notion that despite centuries of foreign domination, the Vietnamese people maintained an intrinsic sense of identity. Economically, the region benefited and suffered in equal measure under Chinese rule. The introduction of new agricultural techniques, irrigation methods, and crop varieties increased productivity. Trade networks brought silk, ceramics, and other goods that enriched the elite. Yet the burden of tribute, forced labor, and taxation extracted by imperial administrators often weighed heavily on ordinary villagers. It was a constant tension between opportunity and subjugation, shaping Vietnamese social consciousness and fostering resilience. Culturally, the period saw a complex interweaving of Vietnamese and Chinese elements. Confucian ideals coexisted with local beliefs, Taoist rituals influenced spiritual practices, and Han artistic motifs appeared alongside indigenous styles in pottery, textiles, and bronze casting. Language and literacy spread, initially as a tool of administration, later as a vehicle for cultural continuity. Oral histories, myths, and legends, many predating the Han occupation, were recorded, adapted, and transmitted, ensuring that Vietnamese cultural memory persisted even as foreign scripts dominated official channels. Strategically, the Vietnamese learned to exploit their geography. The Red River Delta's intricate network of waterways became not only an agricultural advantage, but a defensive one. Guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and strategic retreats became common, allowing smaller, locally organized forces to harass and frustrate larger Chinese armies. Villages became fortresses in miniature, with elevated houses, stockpiles, and hidden escape routes. These strategies, refined over centuries, would later define Vietnamese military doctrine against Mongol invaders, French colonial forces, and even American military campaigns. The era was also marked by subtle forms of cultural resistance. While elite Vietnamese families sometimes adopted Chinese surnames or administrative practices to gain favor, they simultaneously maintained ancestral worship, local festivals, and traditional dress. Folk songs, poetry, and storytelling flourished in rural communities, preserving historical memory and reinforcing social cohesion. Even under domination, Vietnamese culture adapted without losing its essence, blending external influences with internal continuity. Education and scholarship, though introduced by Chinese administrators, became tools of selective empowerment. Vietnamese scholars mastered Confucian classics to navigate imperial examinations, securing positions within local administration. Yet mastery of these texts did not equate to cultural erasure. Scholars often interpreted Confucian principles through local contexts, advocating for policies that balanced imperial expectations with village needs. In this way, knowledge became a means of negotiation and survival, allowing Vietnamese elites to operate within the system while preserving a sense of autonomy. The Northern domination period also brought significant demographic and infrastructural changes. Cities expanded, road networks connected previously isolated settlements, and canals facilitated trade and military mobility. Yet these developments were double-edged. They introduced economic opportunity and administrative efficiency, but also enabled rapid mobilization of labor and resources for the empire's benefit. Villagers learned to navigate this tension, cultivating both resilience and pragmatism, a hallmark of Vietnamese societal character. Despite centuries under foreign rule, the underlying thread of autonomy never disappeared. Vietnamese society, from village elders to regional chieftains, developed an enduring awareness of identity and sovereignty. Resistance could take many forms: armed revolt, cultural preservation, or adaptation that subtly subverted imperial authority. This period cultivated a sophisticated understanding of survival under domination, a skill that would define Vietnamese responses to every subsequent wave of foreign intervention. By the time the Northern domination period ended, the Vietnamese people had absorbed centuries of experience in administration, warfare, culture, and diplomacy. They had learned to integrate external knowledge without relinquishing core identity. They had forged a sense of unity that transcended individual villages, setting the stage for the emergence of independent Vietnamese states under leaders like Ngo Nguyen. In effect, these 9 centuries of Chinese rule, rather than erasing Vietnamese civilization, strengthened its capacity for adaptation, resistance, and cultural endurance. The Trung sisters' legacy, and those of countless unnamed rebels and local leaders, became the moral and symbolic bedrock upon which later generations would build. The lessons of this era were clear. Domination could be endured, external systems could be harnessed for local benefit, and cultural identity could survive even under the shadow of empire. Vietnamese civilization was learning, evolving, and preparing for the moment when independence would once again become a tangible reality. In retrospect, the period from 111 BCE to 938 CE was not merely an era of occupation. It was a crucible in which Vietnamese identity was forged. It was a time of duality, oppression and innovation, submission and resistance, integration and distinction. The people who lived through these centuries understood that survival was not passive. It required strategy, adaptation, and an unwavering sense of who they were. By the end of this long epoch, Vietnam was ready for its first major act of sovereignty, poised to reclaim its independence, reassert its culture, and chart a trajectory that would endure through centuries of challenge and change. The year 938 CE would become one of the most consequential in the annals of Vietnamese history. For over 9 centuries, the northern regions of what is now Vietnam had been under the heavy hand of Chinese domination, subjected to foreign laws, bureaucracies, and armies. Villages had adapted, culture had survived, and resistance had simmered in the rivers, forests, and mountains. Yet, the stage was set for a dramatic reversal, a moment when centuries of endurance and accumulated knowledge would be put to the test. The figure at the center of this transformation was Ngo Nguyen, a general and strategist whose vision would redefine the destiny of the Vietnamese people. Ngo Nguyen's rise was not a sudden stroke of fortune, but the culmination of generations of preparation. The Vietnamese people had learned to adapt Chinese administrative techniques, Confucian principles, and military strategies to their own local realities. They had cultivated intelligence networks through villages, exploited the delta's intricate waterways, and maintained a knowledge of terrain that outsiders would never master. Ngo Nguyen understood that true independence could not be achieved through brute force alone. It required strategy, deception, and an intimate understanding of both one's own environment and the enemy's expectations. The decisive confrontation came at the Bac Dang River, a narrow but strategically crucial waterway. The Southern Han forces, confident in their numerical superiority and battle experience, sailed into what they believed would be a straightforward conquest. Yet No Gwyn had anticipated this moment with precision. Under his command, stakes were driven into the riverbed, submerged and hidden beneath the rising tide, creating a deadly trap for the advancing fleet. When the tide receded, the massive ships of the Southern Han were impaled, immobilized, and vulnerable. Vietnamese forces struck with coordinated ferocity, cutting down the trapped soldiers and annihilating the invading fleet. The victory was not only military but symbolic. For the first time in nearly a millennium, the Vietnamese people had successfully expelled foreign forces, reclaiming control over their homeland. This triumph at Bac Dang River was more than a tactical success. It marked the birth of a sovereign Vietnamese state. No Gwyn declared himself king, establishing a new dynasty and laying the foundations for an independent political identity. The early kingdoms that emerged in the aftermath of this victory faced immense challenges. Years of foreign domination had fragmented political authority, weakened central governance, and left local regions accustomed to self-rule. No Gwyn and his successors were tasked with uniting these disparate territories, consolidating authority, and creating a political framework capable of sustaining sovereignty over the long term. The process of consolidating power was as much about diplomacy and social engineering as it was about military oversight. No Gwyn cultivated alliances with local chieftains, recognized influential families, and integrated them into the emerging governance structure. He also sought to revive and institutionalize traditional practices, reaffirming local rituals, festivals, and religious observances that had persisted despite Chinese influence. This blend of inherited knowledge, local customs, and strategic innovation became the blueprint for Vietnamese statecraft in the early medieval period. One of the remarkable aspects of this era was the way in which Vietnamese society adapted lessons learned under foreign rule. The people had observed Chinese bureaucracy, military organization, and technological methods, and they selectively adopted these innovations to strengthen their own sovereignty. Roads, bridges, and canals built during the Han period were maintained and expanded, enabling trade, communication, and military mobility. Administrative techniques were adapted to local realities, ensuring that governance was both effective and culturally resonant. The Vietnamese state that emerged under No Gwyn was thus a synthesis of inherited wisdom and local ingenuity, capable of asserting independence while remaining deeply connected to its historical and cultural roots. This period also saw the revitalization of social and economic structures. Agricultural systems, long shaped by deltaic irrigation and communal labor, were expanded to support growing populations and sustain the emerging state. Villages became not merely economic units, but integral components of governance and defense. Local leaders were empowered to enforce law, organize labor, and maintain loyalty to the central authority, while still respecting the traditions that bound communities together. The balance between local autonomy and central oversight became a defining feature of early Vietnamese political life. Culture, too, experienced a renaissance. Literature, philosophy, and ritual practices flourished in a society newly freed from foreign dominion. Oral histories, previously constrained or suppressed, were celebrated as instruments of identity and memory. Legends of resistance, including the deeds of the Trung sisters, were revived and retold, reinforcing a narrative of resilience that would inspire future generations. Buddhism, Confucianism, and indigenous spiritual practices coexisted in a complex tapestry, informing ethical norms, governance, and the arts. Temples and ceremonial sites were rebuilt or restored, serving as both spiritual centers and symbols of Vietnamese autonomy. Yet the newfound independence was fragile. The early Vietnamese state faced threats from remnants of foreign forces, internal rivalries, and the natural challenges of deltaic flooding, disease, and resource management. Succession disputes, regional ambitions, and localized uprisings tested the durability of Ngo Nguyen's political innovations. Leadership required constant vigilance, an understanding of social dynamics, and the ability to marshal both military and civil resources effectively. The success of the early independent Vietnamese kingdoms was thus not merely a result of a single victory, but of continuous adaptation, strategic foresight, and the integration of centuries of knowledge about governance, warfare, and culture. The legacy of this era extends far beyond the borders of the 10th century. Ngo Nguyen's victory and the re-establishment of sovereignty created a template for resistance and self-determination that would echo through the following dynasties. Later rulers, from the Lai to the Tran, would draw upon these lessons in consolidating power, defending against invasions, and nurturing cultural development. The understanding that Vietnamese identity could survive, even thrive, under extreme pressure became a defining principle of statecraft. Economically, the period saw the strengthening of trade, both internal and external. Markets grew in importance as centers for the exchange of goods, ideas, and services. Villages connected by rivers and canals participated in networks that extended across the delta and beyond. These commercial activities were closely linked to political stability. Prosperous communities reinforced loyalty, funded defense, and enabled the state to mobilize resources when needed. The Vietnamese state under Ngo Nguyen was thus not only a military success, but a sophisticated economic system rooted in centuries of local knowledge and adaptation. The military innovations of this period were equally profound. The Bac Dang River victory demonstrated the Vietnamese mastery of geography, timing, and engineering. Stake-driven river traps were a reflection of a deep understanding of tides, currents, and ship construction. Local militias, drawn from villages accustomed to defending themselves against small incursions, were organized into strategic units capable of coordinated action against a larger, more conventional army. These lessons in asymmetrical warfare would be repeatedly applied in the centuries to follow against Mongols, Ming forces, French colonists, and even 20th century military powers. Social cohesion, cultural resilience, and political ingenuity combined to create a uniquely Vietnamese model of independence. The people of the Delta learned that true sovereignty depended not only on defeating external forces, but also on maintaining internal cohesion, preserving cultural memory, and adapting foreign ideas to serve local purposes. Education, ritual, and oral history became tools of nation-building, reinforcing loyalty to the state while nurturing a sense of shared identity. By the end of Ngo Nguyen's reign and the first years of independent rule, Vietnam had emerged as a resilient, adaptive, and sovereign polity. The lessons of the Northern domination period of survival under occupation, adaptation under pressure, and the preservation of cultural identity had been fully integrated into statecraft. The victory at Bac Dang River, while dramatic and symbolic, was only the beginning of a much longer journey. The creation of a political and cultural identity that would endure for centuries, guiding Vietnam through dynastic changes, invasions, and colonization. The birth of independent Vietnam was thus both an ending and a beginning, the conclusion of centuries of foreign dominance and the inception of a distinctly Vietnamese political and cultural order. It demonstrated that sovereignty was not simply declared. It was built, reinforced, and protected through intelligence, strategic mastery, and the unwavering will of a people determined to survive. It was a moment that would resonate across generations, a foundation upon which dynasties, scholars, warriors, and ordinary villagers alike would construct the enduring narrative of a nation that refused to be erased. By the dawn of the 11th century, Vietnam had emerged from centuries of foreign domination into a fledgling independence. Yet the task of consolidating power, governance, and cultural identity remained formidable. The Lai dynasty, founded in 1009 by Lai Tsong-yuan, would rise to meet these challenges, establishing not merely a ruling family, but a durable structure of statehood, a cultural renaissance, and a model of governance that would define medieval Vietnam for more than 2 centuries. The story of the Lai dynasty is one of vision, resilience, and the deliberate crafting of a Vietnamese identity that could thrive independently while navigating the pressures of external threats and internal complexity. Lai Tsong-yuan himself was a figure emblematic of the era's transformative possibilities. Born into a minor aristocratic family, he rose through merit and strategic alliances, ultimately assuming the throne with the support of influential court officials, Buddhist clergy, and regional leaders. His ascent symbolized a shift in Vietnamese statecraft. Power would no longer be solely inherited through lineage, but could be attained through service, insight, and alignment with the broader societal needs. This principle of meritocratic leadership, blended with respect for local traditions and spiritual authority, became a hallmark of the Lai governance model. The Lai dynasty's consolidation of power was multidimensional. Militarily, it prioritized the defense of the Red River Delta and strategic northern borders, maintaining vigilance against potential Chinese incursions. Campaigns were conducted with precision and restraint, ensuring that sovereignty was defended without destabilizing internal structures. Simultaneously, the dynasty focused on fortifying internal administration. Officials were trained to implement taxation systems, manage resources, and adjudicate disputes, ensuring that central authority was effective while still accommodating local autonomy. This dual approach, strong central governance paired with respect for village structures, allowed the Lai dynasty to maintain stability in a diverse and geographically challenging landscape. Religion and spirituality played a central role in legitimizing the dynasty and shaping cultural life. Buddhism flourished under Lai rule, not merely as a private practice, but as a guiding philosophy for governance, ethics, and education. Temples were constructed across the kingdom, serving as centers of learning, ritual, and social cohesion. Monks often advised rulers on matters of state, blending spiritual insight with political pragmatism. This integration of Buddhism into governance reinforced moral authority, provided a framework for social order, and nurtured an intellectual climate in which scholarship, art, and philosophy could flourish. Confucianism, though introduced during the earlier periods of Chinese influence, was adapted to local contexts, emphasizing ethical governance, filial responsibility, and civic duty without eroding indigenous traditions. Education became a cornerstone of Lai Vietnam. The dynasty established schools and examination systems designed to cultivate an educated bureaucracy capable of administering the state effectively. Scholars studied both Confucian classics and Buddhist texts, producing a class of officials who were simultaneously moral guides, administrators, and cultural stewards. This investment in intellectual development strengthened governance, promoted cultural continuity, and reinforced a distinct Vietnamese identity capable of resisting external assimilation. It was a period when knowledge was not simply power. It was a tool for preserving sovereignty and guiding society. The Lai rulers also prioritized infrastructure and economic development. Canals and dikes were expanded to control the seasonal flooding of the Red River, ensuring fertile fields and stable harvests. Roads connected rural areas to emerging urban centers, facilitating trade, communication, and the mobilization of resources. Markets grew in significance, becoming hubs for the exchange of goods, ideas, and culture. These economic foundations were critical not only for prosperity, but also for political stability. A well-fed and connected populace was more likely to remain loyal to the central authority. Craftsmanship and industry flourished, with bronze, ceramics, and textiles produced in large quantities, reflecting both technological skill and aesthetic refinement. Cultural development under the Lai dynasty was equally remarkable. Literature, art, and architecture blossomed, reflecting both indigenous traditions and selective adaptation of foreign influences. Temples, pagodas, and palaces were constructed with an attention to harmony, symbolism, and spiritual resonance. These structures were not merely functional. They communicated authority, aesthetic values, and cosmological understanding, blending political, religious, and cultural narratives into the built environment. The design and construction of these monumental works reflected a society increasingly confident in its identity, capable of asserting sovereignty through both material culture and symbolic expression. The dynasty also faced external threats that would test its resilience. The Song dynasty in China occasionally posed military challenges, and regional powers in Southeast Asia influenced political calculations. The Lai rulers responded not merely with force, but with diplomacy, strategic alliances, and intelligence networks that extended throughout the Delta and beyond. Military campaigns were meticulously planned, often emphasizing precision, timing, and knowledge of terrain rather than sheer numerical strength. Vietnamese soldiers were trained in both conventional and guerrilla tactics, drawing upon centuries of accumulated knowledge from the Northern domination period and earlier conflicts. These strategies allowed the Lai dynasty to preserve sovereignty, defend borders, and maintain internal stability. Internal governance under the Lai dynasty was equally sophisticated. Officials were held accountable for performance, and local leaders were integrated into administrative structures through a combination of oversight, incentives, and cultural legitimacy. Villages continued to exercise communal decision-making, but under the guidance of a framework that linked local authority to central oversight. Disputes were adjudicated through a combination of customary law and codified regulations, balancing tradition with centralized control. This system reinforced loyalty, encouraged social cohesion, and ensured that political authority was both effective and culturally resonant. The Lai dynasty's approach to diplomacy and international relations also reflected a nuanced understanding of power and survival. Trade missions, tributary relationships, and cultural exchanges were used to secure political legitimacy, access goods, and project influence. Envoys traveled to neighboring kingdoms, exchanging gifts, knowledge, and ceremonial recognition, while domestic policies ensured that Vietnam retained strategic autonomy. These relationships were complex, requiring constant negotiation, intelligence gathering, and adaptability qualities that would define Vietnamese diplomacy for centuries. Religion, culture, and governance were intertwined in ways that reinforced societal stability. Buddhist rituals and festivals not only provided spiritual guidance, but also served as instruments of social cohesion, reinforcing the authority of the dynasty while nurturing shared values. Art, music, and literature celebrated both the divine and the human, creating a cultural memory that transcended individual reigns and contributed to a sense of enduring identity. Monks and scholars acted as advisors, educators, and chroniclers, ensuring that knowledge, values, and history were transmitted across generations. The Lai dynasty also cultivated a sophisticated understanding of economic and social resilience. Agricultural production was diversified, incorporating new crops and techniques to mitigate famine risk. Water management systems, including dikes, canals, and reservoirs, were meticulously maintained, demonstrating an intimate knowledge of both natural cycles and engineering principles. Trade networks linked villages to urban centers and to neighboring regions, facilitating the flow of goods, ideas, and cultural practices. These strategies created a stable, adaptable economy capable of supporting both civilian prosperity and military readiness. The legacy of the Lai dynasty extends far beyond its two-century reign. By establishing a stable, centralized state grounded in Vietnamese culture and values, the dynasty created the foundations for successive regimes to build upon. Military strategies, administrative systems, religious integration, and cultural achievements all provided a template for governance, resistance, and societal development. The dynasty demonstrated that sovereignty was not merely a matter of military conquest, but of holistic statecraft, the integration of politics, culture, economy, and social cohesion into a coherent and enduring national identity. Education, governance, and culture were interdependent pillars that sustained the Lai state. Scholars produced works in history, philosophy, and law, while religious institutions guided ethical and spiritual life. Bureaucrats administered justice, collected taxes, and coordinated public works, linking local communities to central authority. Farmers and artisans provided the material and economic foundation, ensuring that the state could mobilize resources when necessary. This interplay of social classes, institutions, and cultural practices created a durable framework capable of surviving both internal turbulence and external pressure. Throughout its existence, the Lai dynasty maintained a careful balance between innovation and tradition. While adapting foreign ideas from China and other regions, the rulers ensured that these influences were integrated in ways that reinforced Vietnamese identity rather than erasing it. Legal codes, administrative practices, and philosophical teachings were selectively adopted, blending with indigenous customs, oral traditions, and spiritual practices. This synthesis created a uniquely Vietnamese civilization, one capable of defending its autonomy, nurturing its culture, and projecting stability across centuries. The dynasty's achievements in art, literature, and architecture were not mere aesthetic flourishes. They were instruments of statecraft and identity formation. Temples and palaces embodied authority and cosmology. Literature and chronicles preserved memory, and festivals reinforced communal cohesion. Bronze casting, ceramics, and textiles reflected technological skill and aesthetic sensibility, while also serving as vehicles of political and religious symbolism. Through these creations, the Lai dynasty articulated a vision of Vietnam as both sovereign and culturally distinct, a civilization aware of its past, capable of shaping its present, and confident in its future. In the final assessment, the Lai dynasty represents a high point in the formation of medieval Vietnamese identity. It demonstrated that a small nation, emerging from centuries of domination, could achieve stability, cultural flourishing, and strategic sophistication. The dynasty's focus on integrated governance, religious legitimacy, social cohesion, and military preparedness created a model that would influence all subsequent Vietnamese dynasties. Through the Lai era, Vietnam learned that survival and prosperity depended not solely on military might, but on the intricate orchestration of culture, politics, economy, and societal resilience. The rise of the Tran dynasty in 1225 marked a pivotal turning point in Vietnamese history, an era when the fledgling nation, still consolidating its independence after centuries of foreign domination, would face both extraordinary opportunities and existential threats. The Lai dynasty, which had nurtured stability, culture, and governance for over 2 centuries, was weakened by court intrigue, succession crises, and regional dissent. Into this vacuum stepped the Tran family, a clan whose influence, military acumen, and political savvy would not only secure control over the kingdom, but redefine its capacity to survive, thrive, and defend itself against the most formidable forces of the age. The Tran dynasty would become synonymous with strategic brilliance, cultural flourishing, and an enduring spirit of resilience. The dynasty's ascent was carefully orchestrated. Tran Thursday Du, the chief architect behind the transition from Lai to Tran, recognized the necessity of both political legitimacy and strategic consolidation. By arranging marriages between the Tran and Lai families, co-opting powerful local clans, and neutralizing potential rivals, the Tran established authority not simply through conquest, but through sophisticated social and political engineering. Their rule exemplified a principle that would characterize Vietnamese governance for centuries. Power was maintained not only through force, but through careful alliances, moral authority, and cultural legitimacy. From the outset, the Tran rulers understood that military preparedness would define the dynasty's survival. In the 13th century, the Mongol Empire surged across Eurasia with unprecedented speed and destruction, threatening kingdoms from China to Eastern Europe. Dai Viet, despite its modest size, lay directly in the path of this unstoppable force. Unlike many contemporaries who might have relied solely on fortifications or the hope of diplomacy, the Tran dynasty employed a nuanced understanding of geography, seasonal patterns, and asymmetric warfare. Vietnamese generals, drawing upon centuries of accumulated knowledge from previous struggles against Chinese domination, perfected the art of guerrilla tactics, riverine ambushes, and strategic retreats. The most emblematic demonstration of Tran military ingenuity came during the Second Mongol invasion, culminating in the legendary Battle of Bac Dang River in 1288. Echoing the strategy employed by No Nguyen centuries earlier, stakes were driven into the riverbed, submerged beneath the tide, creating a lethal trap for the advancing Yuan fleet. Vietnamese forces, intimately familiar with local currents and terrain, struck with precision, annihilating the enemy and forcing a retreat that preserved national sovereignty. These victories were not mere accidents of fate. They were the product of meticulous planning, strategic foresight, and a profound understanding of both human and environmental factors in warfare. Yet the Tran dynasty's genius extended beyond the battlefield. Governance under the Tran balanced central authority with local autonomy, integrating village structures into a broader administrative system that reinforced loyalty while respecting tradition. Officials were trained to manage taxation, adjudicate disputes, and oversee infrastructure projects, while local leaders retained influence over communal affairs. This equilibrium ensured that while the central government could mobilize resources efficiently, it did not alienate the populace or destabilize regional networks. Economically, the Tran dynasty capitalized on the fertile lands of the Red River Delta and the strategic positioning of key trade routes. Agricultural output was maximized through sophisticated irrigation systems, dike management, and flood control, ensuring food security even under pressure from conflict or environmental unpredictability. Markets and trading hubs flourished, facilitating the exchange of rice, salt, textiles, and luxury goods. International trade, particularly with southern China and the Khmer Empire, brought new technologies, materials, and cultural influences while reinforcing Vietnam's sovereignty and economic resilience. A prosperous population was a politically loyal population, and the Tran rulers recognized that economic management was inseparable from political survival. Culture during the Tran dynasty was as vibrant as its military and administrative sophistication. Literature, poetry, historiography, and Confucian scholarship flourished alongside the continued prominence of Buddhism. Monasteries functioned as educational centers, cultivating not only spiritual understanding but knowledge of governance, ethics, and strategy. Scholars chronicled history, documented military campaigns, and composed philosophical treatises, creating a rich intellectual landscape that reinforced national identity. Art and architecture reached new heights. Temples, pagodas, and civic structures were constructed with an eye for symbolism, aesthetic harmony, and spiritual resonance, embodying the values and aspirations of a society newly confident in its sovereignty. The Tran period also witnessed innovative approaches to social cohesion and governance. Local communities maintained traditional decision-making structures, yet these were incorporated into a framework that linked them to central authority. Legal codes were standardized, yet flexible enough to accommodate local customs. Communal obligations, religious observances, and civic duties reinforced a sense of shared responsibility, ensuring that governance was experienced as legitimate and culturally coherent rather than imposed and alien. This balance between centralization and local autonomy became a defining feature of Vietnamese statecraft, ensuring both stability and adaptability. The dynasty's resilience was repeatedly tested not only by external invasion, but by internal strife. Succession disputes, aristocratic rivalries, and regional rebellions were met with a combination of military precision, political negotiation, and cultural diplomacy. The Tran rulers demonstrated a profound understanding of human dynamics. Loyalty could be cultivated, dissent managed, and alliances maintained through both incentives and moral authority. Leadership under the Tran was as much about wisdom, foresight, and adaptability as it was about inherited power or military strength. Education under the Tran dynasty became a vehicle for both governance and identity. Confucian classics were taught to create an educated bureaucracy capable of implementing law, collecting taxes, and maintaining social order. Buddhist teachings complemented these lessons, emphasizing ethical governance, moral responsibility, and civic virtue. Monks and scholars served as advisors, educators, and chroniclers, ensuring continuity of knowledge and values across generations. This integration of intellectual, spiritual, and administrative training produced a resilient elite capable of sustaining the dynasty through both peace and conflict. The victories against the Mongols, in particular, carried profound symbolic weight. They demonstrated that a relatively small, well-organized, and culturally cohesive society could repel one of history's largest empires. These successes were celebrated in chronicles, poetry, and folklore, reinforcing a narrative of Vietnamese ingenuity, resilience, and strategic mastery. They were lessons in the power of preparation, adaptation, and the creative use of both natural and human resources. The Tran period thus established enduring principles. Sovereignty was achieved and preserved not solely through numbers or brute force, but through intelligence, planning, and the integration of society, culture, and environment. The Tran dynasty also made lasting contributions to technology and infrastructure. River and canal networks were expanded to support trade, agriculture, and military movement. Fortifications, weapons, and river defenses were continually improved. Administrative systems tracked population, taxation, and resources, enabling rapid mobilization in times of war. These innovations reflected a society deeply aware that survival depended on the integration of engineering, logistics, and strategic foresight. The interplay of technology, culture, governance, and military strategy created a uniquely adaptive civilization capable of enduring centuries of internal and external pressures. Socially, the Tran rulers maintained harmony by reinforcing communal responsibilities, promoting festivals and rituals, and integrating local elites into governance. Loyalty to the state was fostered not through fear alone, but through participation, recognition, and shared identity. Education, religion, and cultural institutions acted as instruments of cohesion, linking villages, cities, and regions into a single political and cultural continuum. This careful attention to social structure allowed the Tran dynasty to maintain unity even during times of severe stress. By the end of the 14th century, the Tran dynasty had solidified a legacy of strategic brilliance, cultural sophistication, and institutional resilience. Its military victories, particularly against the Mongol invasions, exemplified the effectiveness of asymmetric tactics and strategic planning. Its governance blended central authority with local autonomy, balancing stability with flexibility. Its culture, literature, and religious institutions reinforced a distinct Vietnamese identity. The dynasty's achievements demonstrated that a small but cohesive and adaptable society could survive, thrive, and assert its sovereignty in the face of immense challenges. The Tran dynasty's era was a defining moment in the formation of Vietnamese identity. It proved that military skill, political wisdom, economic management, and cultural sophistication were inseparable pillars of a resilient civilization. Its victories and innovations would influence successive dynasties, shaping statecraft, societal norms, and cultural continuity for centuries. The Tran period stands as a testament to what can be achieved when a society harmonizes strategy, governance, culture, and human ingenuity to defend its sovereignty and craft an enduring identity. The 15th century in Vietnam was a period of profound upheaval, marked by dynastic experimentation, foreign incursions, and the persistent struggle to consolidate sovereignty over a fragmented landscape. The fall of the Tran dynasty in 1400 created a power vacuum that would be filled briefly by the Ho dynasty, a regime that sought to centralize authority, modernize governance, and assert control over a kingdom weary from internal divisions. Ho Quy Lai, the founder of this short-lived dynasty, was a formidable reformer and strategist. Still, his ambitions would collide with the inexorable pressures of both internal dissent and external predation, leaving Vietnam vulnerable to occupation by the Ming Empire and initiating decades of political turbulence that would define the subsequent dynasties. Ho Quy Lai's rise to power was emblematic of the era's fluidity and instability. Originally a minister within the waning Tran administration, he maneuvered adeptly within court politics, consolidating power by placing loyalists in key positions, reforming taxation, and asserting control over the military. His vision extended beyond mere consolidation. He sought to centralize authority, implement economic and bureaucratic reforms, and strengthen the state's capacity to manage both civil and military affairs. These reforms included revising land tenure systems, standardizing coinage, and reorganizing administrative structures in an effort to streamline governance. Despite his ambitious reforms, Ho Quy Lai faced deep-seated resistance from entrenched elites, regional lords, and loyalists of the Tran dynasty. The implementation of his policies disrupted traditional power structures, alienating influential families and provincial administrators. While some of his initiatives laid the groundwork for more centralized governance, the turbulence created by their imposition weakened the political cohesion necessary to repel external threats. The internal fragmentation of authority, combined with dissatisfaction among elites, made the kingdom increasingly vulnerable at a time when regional powers were asserting their own dominance. The vulnerability of the Ho dynasty was dramatically exposed in 1407 when the Ming Empire of China launched a full-scale invasion. The Ming forces, equipped with superior numbers, advanced military technology, and seasoned commanders, swiftly overcame the Ho defenses. The dynasty's reforms, though visionary, were insufficient to withstand a military machine of this scale. The occupation that followed marked a severe interruption in Vietnam's sovereignty, as the Ming sought to impose direct control over administration, culture, and resources. Yet, even under foreign domination, Vietnamese society demonstrated remarkable resilience, maintaining linguistic, cultural, and spiritual continuity despite external pressures. It was in this crucible of occupation that the seeds of resistance and eventual revival were sown. Local leaders, scholars, and peasants organized insurgencies, preserving the memory of Vietnamese autonomy and asserting local governance despite the presence of Ming officials. Figures such as Lu Loi would emerge from this resistance, channeling popular discontent and strategic insight into a movement that would restore independence and reshape the political landscape. Lu Loi's leadership was not merely militaristic. It was deeply symbolic, intertwining national identity, cultural revival, and political legitimacy into a coherent framework capable of galvanizing support across social strata. The successful expulsion of the Ming and the establishment of the Liu dynasty in 1428 represented a turning point in Vietnam's history. The Liu rulers inherited a society that had been tested by decades of foreign domination and internal instability, and their governance emphasized both consolidation of authority and restoration of cultural identity. Administrative reforms implemented under the Liu sought to create a more hierarchical yet flexible bureaucracy, integrating local leaders while asserting central control over taxation, land, and military organization. These measures allowed the dynasty to maintain stability over a kingdom still defined by its diverse geography and decentralized communities. Under the Liu dynasty, Confucianism was reinforced as the guiding principle of governance, shaping education, law, and civil administration. Examinations for bureaucratic positions were instituted, ensuring that officials were selected based on merit and knowledge of Confucian texts, while Buddhism continued to influence ethical, social, and spiritual life. The integration of Confucian and Buddhist principles created a dual framework of moral governance. Officials were trained to balance the demands of statecraft with ethical responsibility, while religious institutions provided guidance, legitimacy, and social cohesion. The Liu rulers also faced the challenge of defending Vietnam's sovereignty in a turbulent regional context. Neighboring powers, including the remnants of Chinese dynastic influence, Kampa, and emerging Southeast Asian states, necessitated a vigilant and adaptable military strategy. Vietnam's armies were organized with attention to local knowledge, terrain, and flexible tactics, drawing upon centuries of experience in riverine warfare, guerrilla operations, and fortification engineering. These strategies emphasized mobility, intelligence, and the use of environmental advantages, allowing Vietnamese forces to counter both conventional and unconventional threats. Economically, the period saw efforts to stabilize agriculture, expand trade, and enhance resource management. Irrigation systems, dikes, and canals were maintained and extended to protect fertile lands and ensure consistent harvests. Markets and trade networks connected rural and urban communities, while foreign trade brought both material wealth and technological knowledge. Economic resilience became a pillar of political stability, reinforcing the state's capacity to fund military defenses, maintain bureaucratic structures, and support cultural institutions. Vietnam's economy under the Liu was thus deeply interconnected with governance, military preparedness, and societal cohesion. Cultural revival and intellectual flourishing were central to the Liu dynasty's legitimacy. Literature, historiography, and philosophy were encouraged, with scholars chronicling history, codifying laws, and producing works that celebrated national identity. Temples, pagodas, and civic architecture were constructed with attention to both aesthetic and symbolic meaning, reinforcing the authority of the state while sustaining spiritual and communal life. Festivals, rituals, and religious observances continued to strengthen social cohesion, linking individual communities to the broader identity of the Vietnamese state. Yet the centuries following the Liu dynasty's initial consolidation were marked by periodic instability, factional disputes, and external pressures. Internal divisions, often exacerbated by regional loyalties and aristocratic rivalries, challenged the central authority. At the same time, pressure from foreign powers, whether through trade, diplomacy, or invasion, necessitated careful political maneuvering. Vietnam's ability to maintain sovereignty and cultural identity during this period reflected a deep understanding of the interplay between internal governance, social cohesion, and strategic diplomacy. The later dynasties leading up to the Nguyen period witnessed ongoing territorial consolidation, including campaigns to expand southward into Kampa lands, a process known as Nam Tien. This expansion integrated new regions, diversified the population, and extended Vietnam's control over strategic trade routes and fertile lands. Governance structures were adapted to manage these newly incorporated territories, balancing local autonomy with centralized oversight. These expansions reinforced Vietnam's sovereignty, economic base, and strategic depth while shaping its demographic and cultural landscape for centuries to come. The Ho and subsequent dynasties illustrate a central theme in Vietnamese history: resilience in the face of both internal disruption and foreign domination. Each regime, from the visionary reforms of Ho Qui Lai to the consolidation of the Lu, navigated a complex interplay of politics, culture, economy, and military strategy. Sovereignty was never guaranteed. It had to be continuously negotiated, defended, and reinforced through governance, social cohesion, and cultural legitimacy. The Vietnamese state, despite periods of occupation, rebellion, and internal discord, retained a continuity that allowed it to endure and eventually flourish. Education, religion, and culture were consistently employed as instruments of statecraft. Confucian bureaucrats ensured the efficient administration of law and taxation, while Buddhist institutions provided ethical guidance and moral authority. Intellectuals chronicled history and codified legal frameworks, ensuring that knowledge and cultural memory were preserved. Festivals, rituals, and communal observances strengthened social cohesion and reinforced allegiance to the state. The interplay between governance, culture, and social structure created a resilient society capable of adapting to crises while maintaining continuity across generations. Military strategy evolved to meet both internal and external challenges. Vietnamese armies combined conventional tactics with irregular warfare, exploiting local geography and climate. Riverine ambushes, mountain defenses, and coordinated village militias allowed the state to counter larger and better-equipped invaders. Knowledge of terrain, seasonal cycles, and local conditions became as important as numbers or technology, reflecting a deeply embedded understanding of asymmetrical warfare that had been refined over centuries. By the early 19th century, the accumulation of these strategies, reforms, and cultural developments set the stage for the Nguyen dynasty, which would unify Vietnam under a single banner. The resilience forged through centuries of dynastic change, foreign occupation, and social adaptation provided the foundation upon which a modern, centralized state could be constructed. The lessons of the Ho, Lu, and later dynasties illustrate that Vietnamese history is defined less by uninterrupted stability than by an enduring capacity to adapt, survive, and rebuild in the face of existential challenges. The period from 1400 to 1802 demonstrates that sovereignty is neither static nor guaranteed. It must be constantly defended through political acumen, cultural legitimacy, military preparedness, and social cohesion. The Ho dynasty's visionary reforms, the Lu dynasty's consolidation, and the territorial expansions of later rulers collectively exemplify a society that learned to navigate both internal and external pressures while preserving identity. Vietnam's endurance during these centuries stands as a testament to the skill, foresight, and resilience of its rulers and people alike, illustrating a civilization that could absorb disruption, adapt to shifting realities, and emerge with its sovereignty and culture intact. In 1802, after decades of internal strife, dynastic rivalries, and regional fragmentation, Nguyen emerged as the unifier of Vietnam, establishing the Nguyen dynasty and marking the beginning of a new epoch in the nation's history. This consolidation was not merely a triumph of military force. It represented the culmination of centuries of struggle, adaptation, and political sophistication that had been refined under preceding dynasties. Vietnam, for the first time in generations, was reunited under a single banner stretching from the Red River Delta in the north to the fertile Mekong Delta in the south, embodying the ambitions of both centralized authority and territorial expansion. Nguyen, who would later assume the title Emperor Jialong, had spent decades navigating a landscape of shifting allegiances, regional lords, and foreign intervention. His rise was facilitated by strategic alliances, including critical support from French military advisors and access to advanced Western weaponry. This blend of indigenous military acumen and foreign technological advantage enabled the unification of a fractured land, solidifying the Nguyen dynasty's authority over a population long accustomed to decentralization and regional autonomy. The dynasty's foundation was, therefore, rooted in pragmatism, strategic foresight, and a deep understanding of both domestic and international power dynamics. Central to Nguyen governance was the codification and implementation of Confucian principles. The dynasty sought to reinforce hierarchical social order, moral governance, and bureaucratic efficiency. Officials were meticulously trained and appointed through examination systems designed to ensure competence, loyalty, and ideological conformity. The Confucian model dictated not only administrative practice, but social organization, emphasizing filial piety, communal responsibility, and adherence to law. While this system reinforced the authority of the state, it also served as a tool for cultural consolidation, unifying diverse regions under a shared moral and legal framework. Beyond governance, the Nguyen dynasty pursued territorial consolidation through the continued expansion known as Nam Tien, or March to the South. This process involved the annexation of former Kampa territories and the integration of new lands into the Vietnamese political, economic, and cultural sphere. Settlements were established, agricultural infrastructure extended, and administrative systems imposed to assimilate local populations. These expansions were not without resistance. Both indigenous communities and remnants of prior polities challenged Nguyen authority. Yet the dynasty's combination of military force, bureaucratic oversight, and cultural assimilation ensured that these new territories became inseparable components of a unified Vietnam. Economically, the Nguyen dynasty focused on stabilizing agricultural production, regulating trade, and developing infrastructure capable of sustaining a vast and diverse population. The construction of dikes, canals, and irrigation networks extended the arable reach of the Mekong and Red River deltas, while careful management of land tenure and taxation ensured the state's financial stability. Trade, both domestic and international, became increasingly important, with markets in urban centers facilitating the exchange of rice, handicrafts, metals, and imported goods. The dynasty's economic policies were closely intertwined with its administrative and military priorities. A prosperous population provided revenue, manpower, and social cohesion essential to the durability of centralized authority. Culturally, the Nguyen dynasty actively promoted both Confucian and Buddhist ideals, creating a dual framework that shaped intellectual, spiritual, and social life. Confucianism guided statecraft, education, and law, while Buddhism continued to influence ethics, spiritual practice, and social morality. Monasteries functioned as centers of learning, offering instruction not only in religious doctrine, but in philosophy, literature, and governance. The patronage of scholars, poets, and artists under the Nguyen dynasty reinforced cultural identity, fostering an intellectual climate in which the state's authority and Vietnamese tradition were mutually reinforcing. Military strategy remained a central pillar of Nguyen governance. The dynasty maintained a professional army capable of both conventional and irregular warfare, structured to address internal rebellion and external threats. Fortifications were constructed along strategic riverine and coastal positions, reflecting an understanding of the geographic advantages inherent in Vietnam's complex terrain. Military organization was complemented by administrative oversight, ensuring the mobilization of resources, the recruitment and training of soldiers, and the integration of local militias into a cohesive national defense apparatus. The dynasty's success in unifying Vietnam owed as much to this strategic military infrastructure as to the brilliance of its leadership. Then, when rulers were acutely aware of the external pressures posed by European colonial powers, particularly France, whose influence in Southeast Asia was expanding, diplomatic engagement became a necessity, balancing trade, political recognition, and strategic caution. The dynasty's interactions with the French were complex. Advisors and military technology were sometimes welcomed, yet the threat of foreign domination remained ever present. This tension would intensify in the coming decades, setting the stage for the profound challenges of colonization that would define Vietnam's trajectory in the mid-19th century. Societally, the Nguyen dynasty emphasized stability and hierarchical organization. Local elites were incorporated into the administrative framework, serving as intermediaries between the central authority and the regional populations. Communities were organized around village structures, which managed taxation, labor, and local justice while remaining accountable to the state. Rituals, festivals, and Confucian ceremonies reinforced social cohesion, linking individual obligations to the broader authority of the emperor and the moral framework of the state. Education, moral instruction, and religious observance were deliberately integrated into daily life, ensuring the perpetuation of social norms and political loyalty across generations. Infrastructure development under the Nguyen dynasty was extensive and multifaceted. Roads, canals, and waterways facilitated trade, troop movements, and administrative oversight, while fortifications protected strategic locations. Urban centers such as Hue, the dynastic capital, were designed to reflect both the grandeur of imperial authority and the practical needs of governance. Palaces, administrative buildings, and ceremonial spaces were carefully planned to project legitimacy, centralize bureaucratic functions, and reinforce the dynasty's symbolic power. These infrastructural investments enhanced both the state's functionality and its perception of permanence. Education and scholarship flourished under the Nguyen dynasty as instruments of governance and cultural continuity. Confucian schools trained officials in philosophy, law, and administration, while Buddhist institutions nurtured spiritual and ethical development. Intellectual production was diverse. Historical chronicles preserved memory and identity, legal codifications standardized governance, and literary works celebrated both the natural world and the moral ideals of the society. This integrated approach to learning ensured that authority, culture, and ethical governance were deeply intertwined, reinforcing the dynasty's legitimacy and long-term stability. By the mid-19th century, the Nguyen dynasty had established a unified, centrally governed, and culturally cohesive Vietnam, yet it faced growing internal and external challenges. Regional uprisings, administrative corruption, and socioeconomic pressures strained the state's ability to maintain cohesion, while increasing European colonial ambitions threatened sovereignty. The dynasty's policies, infrastructure, and military organization provided a foundation for governance, yet they would soon be tested by forces far beyond the traditional political and military frameworks of Vietnam. The Nguyen dynasty's era is characterized by a careful balancing act, consolidating political authority, integrating newly conquered territories, promoting economic stability, cultivating culture, and preparing militarily for both internal and external threats. Its rulers demonstrated that successful governance in Vietnam required not only force or diplomacy, but a sophisticated understanding of society, geography, and culture. Authority was reinforced through education, ritual, military organization, and cultural patronage, creating a cohesive national identity capable of withstanding the pressures of fragmentation and foreign intervention. The historical significance of the Nguyen dynasty extends beyond administrative achievement. Its unification of Vietnam, consolidation of Confucian governance, and territorial expansion provided the foundation upon which the nation would face the coming challenges of European colonization. The integration of southern lands during the Nam Tien transformed Vietnam's demographic, economic, and strategic landscape, making it a larger, more diverse, and more complex polity than it had been under previous dynasties. These structural and cultural developments were crucial in shaping the nation's capacity to resist, adapt, and survive the profound transformations of the 19th century. The Nguyen dynasty's accomplishments, however, must be understood in the context of their fragility. While they unified and centralized authority, the pressures of a changing global order, the encroachment of European powers, and persistent internal challenges foreshadowed the vulnerabilities that would emerge with French colonization. Yet even in this, the dynasty's legacy is clear. It established a coherent administrative, cultural, and territorial framework that defined Vietnam as a political and cultural entity, capable of enduring, adapting, and ultimately asserting its identity in the centuries that followed. The period from 1802 to 1858 is thus both a culmination of centuries of Vietnamese statecraft and a prelude to the existential challenges of colonialism. The Nguyen dynasty's ability to unify a fragmented land, integrate diverse territories, codify governance, and sustain cultural cohesion illustrates the persistent adaptability of Vietnamese civilization. Its achievements, while tested in the decades to come, provide a lens through which to understand Vietnam's historical resilience, the interplay of governance and culture, and the complex processes by which sovereignty, identity, and survival are negotiated over centuries. The mid-19th century marked the beginning of a profound transformation in Vietnam, as the arrival of French forces in 1858 initiated a period of nearly a century of colonization, reshaping every facet of Vietnamese life. The Nguyen dynasty, already grappling with internal challenges and administrative inefficiencies, found itself increasingly vulnerable to foreign intervention. France's ambitions were not merely military but ideological, economic, and cultural, seeking to integrate Vietnam into a wider colonial system across Southeast Asia known as French Indochina. The conquest and subsequent colonization were both violent and systematic, leaving an indelible mark on Vietnamese sovereignty, society, and identity. The French invasion began with the bombardment of Da Nang and Saigon, signaling the onset of a relentless campaign to subdue the Vietnamese state. Nguyen authority, already weakened by internal factionalism, regional discontent, and economic pressures, proved ill-prepared to repel a technologically advanced European force. Steam-powered gunboats, modern artillery, and disciplined infantry allowed the French to dominate the riverine and coastal landscapes, undermining traditional Vietnamese defensive strategies that had succeeded against previous regional invaders. These initial victories set the stage for a gradual but inexorable expansion of French control. By the 1880s, France had established a formal protectorate over northern and central Vietnam, with Cochinchina in the south fully annexed as a colony. Administrative systems were imposed, exploiting the existing Nguyen bureaucracy where convenient, but replacing it with French officials, legal codes, and economic structures designed to extract resources and integrate Vietnam into the imperial economy. Traditional governance was subordinated to colonial priorities, with local officials acting primarily as intermediaries in the extraction of revenue, labor, and agricultural surplus. French colonialism, therefore, was not simply an occupation but a complete reorganization of state, society, and economy to serve metropolitan interests. The economic impact of French colonization was profound. Rice production was intensified to feed global markets. Plantations for cash crops such as rubber, coffee, and tea were established, and mining operations for coal and precious minerals were expanded. Infrastructure, railways, ports, and telegraph lines were built not to serve Vietnamese communities, but to facilitate extraction and transport for colonial profit. Urban centers grew, particularly Saigon and Hanoi. Yet these cities were divided between French administrative quarters and local quarters, symbolizing both modernization and subjugation. Economic development under colonial rule was tightly intertwined with social disruption. Traditional livelihoods were displaced, land tenure systems were manipulated to favor French planters, and peasant communities were often conscripted into forced labor. Socially and culturally, the French imposed policies designed to weaken Vietnamese identity while promoting assimilation into French norms. Education was a primary instrument of colonial influence. French-language schools cultivated a small elite versed in European ideas, creating intermediaries who would serve the colonial administration. At the same time, Confucian academies and Buddhist institutions were marginalized, reducing their influence in shaping governance, ethics, and social cohesion. Christianity was actively promoted, often supported by colonial authority, introducing new religious dynamics into a society deeply rooted in Buddhism, ancestor worship, and Confucian morality. This cultural re-engineering was subtle and pervasive, creating divisions between those who adapted, those who resisted, and those caught in between. Resistance to French colonization emerged almost immediately, drawing on centuries of Vietnamese resilience against foreign domination. Early uprisings, often localized and poorly coordinated, reflected the determination of communities unwilling to surrender autonomy, land, and cultural identity. Leaders such as Phan Dinh Phong, Hong Hoa Tam, and Nguyen Trung Truc became symbols of resistance, employing guerrilla tactics, knowledge of terrain, and popular support to challenge French authority. Though ultimately suppressed, these rebellions reinforced a narrative of persistent defiance, cultivating a sense of national consciousness that would shape future movements. Nationalist sentiment evolved over decades, fueled by both direct oppression and exposure to global ideas. Educated elites, particularly those who studied in France or engaged with modern political thought, began articulating visions of an independent Vietnam, drawing upon historical memory, Confucian ideals, and modern notions of sovereignty and rights. Newspapers, pamphlets, and clandestine societies spread anti-colonial ideas, linking intellectual awakening with grassroots activism. The emergence of the Vietnam Quang Phuc Hoi, the Dong Du movement, and other nationalist groups reflected an increasingly sophisticated challenge to colonial authority, blending armed resistance, political strategy, and ideological mobilization. French colonization also reshaped the demographic and social fabric of Vietnam. Urbanization increased as economic opportunities, albeit limited and controlled, drew populations into colonial cities. Rural communities faced land dispossession, high taxation, and forced labor, contributing to cycles of poverty, migration, and social unrest. The imposition of European legal systems disrupted traditional dispute resolution mechanisms, creating tension between customary practice and colonial law. At the same time, the colonial period introduced new forms of commerce, technology, and infrastructure, creating a paradoxical environment in which modernity and subjugation existed side by side. Military and administrative consolidation under the French relied on a combination of coercion, strategic alliances, and bureaucratic efficiency. Vietnamese soldiers were conscripted into colonial forces, often serving under French officers, while local mandarins were co-opted to maintain civil administration. The French meticulously mapped the terrain, developed detailed tax records, and integrated surveillance networks, ensuring that potential resistance could be monitored, disrupted, and controlled. This system of governance was both invasive and methodical, reflecting a colonial philosophy that prioritized efficiency and control over local consent or cultural continuity. Despite the pressures of colonization, Vietnamese culture persisted, adapted, and even subtly resisted colonial influence. Literature, poetry, religious practices, and folk traditions continued to thrive, often covertly or in forms less visible to colonial authorities. The Vietnamese language, Confucian values, and Buddhist institutions acted as anchors of identity, providing continuity across decades of upheaval. These cultural pillars became intertwined with nationalist movements, providing historical legitimacy, moral justification, and organizational networks for those seeking to reclaim sovereignty. Education, as a tool of both colonial control and future resistance, became a contested space. French schools trained a small elite, yet exposure to Western ideas enabled the formation of political consciousness and revolutionary thought. Vietnamese students who engaged with European political theory, socialism, and nationalism would later become leaders of anti-colonial movements, bridging intellectual discourse and practical activism. This dialectic between imposed education and emancipatory knowledge illustrates the complex interaction between domination and resistance, a hallmark of Vietnam's colonial experience. By the early 20th century, the Vietnamese nationalist movement had grown increasingly organized and ideologically coherent. Revolutionary groups, such as the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, founded by Ho Chi Minh and his contemporaries, articulated a vision for an independent Vietnam grounded in both historical memory and modern political theory. Armed uprisings, political activism, and labor organization challenged French authority, while international developments such as World War I, the rise of communism, and anti-colonial movements across Asia provided strategic inspiration. The struggle for independence became not only a military or political campaign, but a profound contest over identity, culture, and the very definition of Vietnamese nationhood. The period of French colonization, therefore, cannot be understood solely as oppression. It was also an era in which Vietnam's social, political, and cultural structures were tested, adapted, and transformed. The strategies of governance, resistance, and adaptation employed during this time laid the groundwork for the subsequent independence struggle. The imposition of colonial authority catalyzed national consciousness, sharpened organizational capacity, and clarified the stakes of sovereignty. By the eve of World War II, Vietnam had developed both the historical memory and the strategic foresight necessary to embark on a sustained struggle for self-determination. French colonization fundamentally reshaped Vietnamese society, creating a complex landscape of oppression, adaptation, and resistance. Traditional authority structures were undermined, yet cultural identity persisted. Economic exploitation was rampant, yet new infrastructures and urban centers were introduced. Intellectual life was constrained, yet nationalist ideologies began to flourish. The colonial experience forged resilience, strategic thinking, and social cohesion, even as it imposed unprecedented challenges. The lessons learned during these decades would prove decisive during the independence movements that followed, shaping the political, military, and ideological contours of modern Vietnam. The devastation of World War II altered the balance of power in Southeast Asia and created the conditions for Vietnam's long-suppressed aspirations for independence to surge to the forefront. French colonial authority, weakened by global conflict and Japanese occupation during the war years, faced an emboldened Vietnamese nationalist movement. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not merely challenge colonial rule, but redefine Vietnam's sovereignty, identity, and place in the modern world. Central to this transformative period was Ho Chi Minh, a revolutionary figure whose life and vision would anchor the struggle for independence, uniting disparate movements and providing a coherent ideological and strategic framework for resistance. Ho Chi Minh, having spent decades traveling, studying, and engaging with international communist movements, returned to Vietnam with a vision that fused anti-colonial nationalism with socialist ideology. The formation of the Viet Minh League for the Independence of Vietnam in 1941 represented the crystallization of this vision, an organization committed to mobilizing the population, coordinating resistance against Japanese occupation, and ultimately challenging French colonial authority. The Viet Minh were not merely a military force. They were a multifaceted movement, deeply embedded in villages, cultivating local support, and providing an alternative governance structure in areas beyond the reach of colonial control. The end of World War II created an unprecedented opportunity. Japan's surrender in 1945 left Vietnam in a power vacuum, with French colonial forces attempting to reassert control while the Allied powers were largely distracted by reconstruction in Europe and Asia. The Viet Minh seized this moment, declaring the independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam on September 2, 1945, in Hanoi. Ho Chi Minh's speech invoked centuries of struggle, drawing upon historical memory, Confucian and nationalist rhetoric, and appeals to the broader population to unite under a common cause. This declaration was both symbolic and practical. It established a provisional government capable of administering local affairs while asserting Vietnam's claim to sovereignty on the international stage. Yet independence was far from secure. The French, determined to reclaim their colony, began a systematic campaign to re-establish control, leading to the outbreak of the First Indochina War in late 1946. The conflict was marked by asymmetrical warfare, as the Viet Minh leveraged intimate knowledge of local terrain, guerrilla tactics, and popular support to counter a better-equipped, conventional European army. Rural villages became strategic centers, providing both recruits and sustenance for resistance operations. Supply lines were improvised, and communication networks operated under constant threat of disruption. The Viet Minh strategy emphasized mobility, intelligence, and adaptability, reflecting a synthesis of military pragmatism and ideological commitment. The war was brutal and protracted, exposing both sides to the limitations of their military, logistical, and political capabilities. French forces relied on fortified positions, artillery, and aerial bombardments. Yet they struggled to assert control over Vietnam's mountainous and forested regions, where local populations remained loyal to the Viet Minh. The conflict was as much political as it was military. Winning the hearts and minds of the population became critical, as legitimacy derived from popular support increasingly outweighed the projection of European power. Education, propaganda, and social programs implemented by the Viet Minh helped to consolidate support and maintain cohesion under conditions of extreme duress. International dynamics further complicated the conflict. The emerging Cold War framed the First Indochina War within a global context, with the Soviet Union and China providing ideological, logistical, and material support to the Viet Minh, while France sought assistance from Western allies. The war, therefore, was not merely a struggle for Vietnamese independence, but a theater in which broader ideological, political, and strategic forces played out. Recognition, supply, and diplomacy became as crucial as battlefield success, requiring the Viet Minh to navigate both domestic and international landscapes with exceptional acumen. The decisive moment of the First Indochina War occurred at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. French forces, confident in their fortified positions and superior artillery, underestimated both the ingenuity and determination of the Viet Minh. General Von Nguyen Giap orchestrated a comprehensive siege, employing heavy use of trenches, artillery emplacement, and logistical coordination to isolate and systematically dismantle the French garrison. The victory was not merely military. It was emblematic of a larger principle. A small but determined and strategically adept force intimately connected to the social fabric and terrain of its country could overcome the technological and numerical superiority of a colonial power. Dien Bien Phu became an enduring symbol of resilience, strategy, and the assertion of national sovereignty against foreign domination. The Geneva Accords, signed later in 1954, formalized the cessation of hostilities and the division of Vietnam at the 17th parallel, creating North and South Vietnam. The accords were a pragmatic compromise, reflecting both the military stalemate and the competing geopolitical interests of the Cold War. While temporarily partitioned, Vietnam's aspiration for reunification under sovereign control remained a guiding principle for both the leadership in Hanoi and nationalist movements throughout the country. The division would shape political, social, and military developments for the subsequent 2 decades, setting the stage for another era of conflict, resistance, and transformation. During this period, social and political structures were profoundly reshaped. In the North, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam established land reforms, educational programs, and social initiatives designed to consolidate support and build administrative capacity. In the South, under French-backed authority, governance was less cohesive, with competing factions and limited legitimacy. The experience of war, occupation, and resistance created enduring patterns of mobilization, organization, and societal resilience that would influence Vietnam's political culture for generations. Communities learned to adapt to shifting authorities, integrate revolutionary ideology into daily life, and survive under conditions of extreme uncertainty and danger. Cultural identity, historically resilient, became a central tool in both mobilization and legitimacy. The Viet Minh drew upon historical narratives of resistance against Chinese domination, the valor of the Tran dynasty against the Mongols, and centuries of anti-colonial struggle to foster a sense of continuity and purpose. Literature, oral histories, and communal memory were leveraged to reinforce both ideological commitment and collective identity. Education, propaganda, and cultural rituals were interwoven into the operational fabric of resistance, creating a deeply embedded, socially coherent movement capable of enduring decades of hardship. The First Indochina War also catalyzed the emergence of Vietnam's modern military doctrine. Lessons in guerrilla warfare, the strategic use of terrain, civil-military integration, and population mobilization became institutionalized, forming the foundation of tactics that would later define the Vietnam War. These strategies reflected a synthesis of historical experience, ideological commitment, and practical innovation, illustrating the continuity of Vietnamese strategic thinking across centuries. Military training, local coordination, and intelligence gathering were integrated into a cohesive system that balanced flexibility with discipline, enabling the Viet Minh to adapt to evolving circumstances with remarkable effectiveness. Economically, the war imposed enormous strains, yet it also demonstrated the capacity of communities to self-organize. Rural production, while disrupted, was maintained through cooperative systems, resource redistribution, and careful management of supply chains. Villages became operational hubs, supporting both combat operations and civilian needs. This integration of social, economic, and military functions exemplified the Vietnamese approach to warfare. The nation's resilience derived not only from leadership or ideology, but from the mobilization of society as a whole, with each component reinforcing the others. The period from 1945 to 1954 was therefore transformative on multiple levels. It marked the end of formal French colonial domination, affirmed the principle of Vietnamese sovereignty, and established patterns of resistance, governance, and social mobilization that would shape the country's future. Ho Chi Minh's leadership provided ideological clarity, organizational cohesion, and strategic vision, demonstrating the critical interplay between political acumen, military capability, and social legitimacy. The Viet Minh's success at Dien Bien Phu and the broader First Indochina War reflected the culmination of decades of adaptation, learning, and resilience in the face of foreign domination. By the conclusion of this period, Vietnam had achieved de facto independence in the north, with a provisional government, administrative structures, and social institutions capable of sustaining itself. Yet the division imposed by the Geneva Accords created new political challenges, foreshadowing the intensification of conflict, foreign intervention, and ideological confrontation in the decades to come. The lessons of resistance, unity, and strategic foresight remained central, shaping both national identity and the tactical, political, and cultural frameworks that would guide Vietnam's ongoing struggle for complete sovereignty. The Vietnam War, known to its participants as the Second Indochina War, was not simply a clash of armies across a divided nation. It was the culmination of centuries of conflict, colonial oppression, and the relentless pursuit of sovereignty that had defined Vietnamese history. From 1955 to 1975, the nation became a crucible in which foreign ambition, ideological confrontation, and the resilience of a people intersected in a conflict whose intensity, duration, and devastation would leave an indelible mark on Vietnam and the world. The war pitted North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh and guided by the principles forged during the struggle against French colonialism, against South Vietnam, backed by the United States, South Korea, Australia, and other Western allies. It was both a civil conflict and a global proxy war, framed by the ideological confrontation of the Cold War, in which democracy and communism, nationalism and imperialism collided with catastrophic consequences. The roots of the conflict extended deep into the historical memory of the Vietnamese people. North Vietnam sought reunification under a government that claimed to represent the will of a sovereign nation, drawing upon a legacy of resistance to foreign domination that stretched from Chinese occupations to French colonization. The ideological framework was explicitly revolutionary. The North combined nationalism with socialism, framing the war as both a struggle for independence and a social transformation, promising land reform, industrial development, and societal restructuring. In contrast, South Vietnam, politically fragmented and often perceived as a puppet of foreign powers, struggled to assert legitimacy, facing internal corruption, weak institutions, and political instability that eroded public confidence and social cohesion. Military strategy during the Vietnam War reflected the interplay between technology, terrain, and human ingenuity. North Vietnam and the Viet Cong, utilizing guerrilla tactics honed over decades of resistance, relied on intimate knowledge of rivers, jungles, and mountains to offset the technological and numerical superiority of U.S.-backed forces. Complex tunnel networks, improvised supply lines, and ambush strategies allowed relatively small forces to impose disproportionate costs on the enemy. The war was characterized not merely by battlefield engagements, but by psychological, political, and logistical dimensions, in which control of populations, propaganda, and mobility were as critical as artillery, aircraft, or armor. U.S. involvement intensified after the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, escalating military commitment to unprecedented levels. American forces brought superior firepower, helicopters, mechanized units, and strategic bombing campaigns that devastated the countryside and urban centers alike. The use of chemical defoliants, napalm, and carpet bombing transformed the landscape, leaving lasting scars on both the environment and civilian populations. Yet, despite overwhelming technology, the foreign forces were often unable to subvert local loyalty, anticipate guerrilla tactics, or sustain long-term operational coherence. Vietnamese resilience, rooted in centuries of adaptive warfare, social cohesion, and ideological commitment, repeatedly countered technological superiority. The human cost of the conflict was staggering. Millions of Vietnamese, both combatants and civilians, were killed, wounded, or displaced. Cities were bombed, villages were razed, and the countryside was subjected to constant upheaval. Families were divided, livelihoods destroyed, and traditional social structures destabilized. Yet, even amid such devastation, Vietnamese culture, identity, and social networks endured. Local communities provided intelligence, shelter, and sustenance to the resistance, maintaining cohesion despite relentless external pressures. Religion, ritual, and communal life continued to bind people together, reinforcing identity and solidarity in the face of existential threat. The Vietnam War was also a war of ideas, in which propaganda, media, and ideological framing played central roles. The North portrayed the conflict as a continuation of centuries of anti-imperial struggle, invoking historical heroes, collective memory, and national sovereignty to legitimize its cause. South Vietnam, with American support, framed the war as a fight against communism, emphasizing ideological opposition rather than historical continuity. The clash of narratives was as decisive as military operations, shaping international perception, domestic morale, and the political legitimacy of the warring parties. Mass media coverage, unprecedented in its immediacy and visibility, amplified these ideological battles, drawing global attention to a conflict that was at once intensely local and profoundly international. Battles across Vietnam demonstrated both the ingenuity and endurance of the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. The Tet Offensive in 1968, a coordinated series of attacks across South Vietnam, was a strategic and psychological turning point. While militarily costly, it shattered the perception of American and South Vietnamese control, demonstrating that the conflict could not be resolved through conventional force alone. The offensive galvanized international opinion, fueled anti-war movements, and exposed the limits of foreign intervention. It underscored a central lesson in Vietnamese history. Technology and firepower are insufficient without understanding the social, geographic, and psychological dimensions of a society determined to resist. Throughout the war, the North's approach integrated military, political, and social strategies. Land reform, education campaigns, and governance initiatives were used to consolidate control in liberated areas, providing the population with services, justice, and ideological coherence. Villages were not merely military assets, but centers of administration, culture, and resilience. This integration of governance and military strategy allowed the North to maintain legitimacy, sustain recruitment, and mobilize resources effectively, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of war as a total social endeavor rather than a sequence of isolated battles. Meanwhile, the South faced persistent challenges in maintaining cohesion, legitimacy, and effectiveness. Corruption, factionalism, and dependence on foreign support undermined the political and military structures, creating a disconnection between government authority and popular allegiance. Programs intended to win hearts and minds were often poorly implemented or undermined by counterproductive policies, while rural populations frequently remained sympathetic to the North or neutral. This asymmetry between social legitimacy and military capability became a defining feature of the conflict, highlighting the centrality of governance, identity, and popular support in determining the outcome of war. By 1973, the Paris Peace Accords formalized a ceasefire and the withdrawal of U.S. forces, yet the war did not conclude. Fighting continued between North and South Vietnam as the structural, ideological, and social dynamics that had defined the conflict persisted. The resilience, strategy, and commitment of the North Vietnamese forces, combined with the fragility of the South Vietnamese state, ultimately led to the fall of Saigon in April 1975. The capture of the city marked the formal reunification of Vietnam under communist rule, concluding a conflict that had devastated the nation but also reaffirmed the enduring principles of sovereignty, resilience, and national identity that had characterized Vietnamese history for centuries. The post-war implications were profound. Infrastructure lay in ruins, social systems were disrupted, and the human toll was immense. Yet the war also forged a sense of national identity, solidarity, and continuity that transcended the devastation. Vietnamese governance, culture, and social structures, though strained, endured. Lessons learned in strategy, social mobilization, and governance during the conflict informed post-war reconstruction, economic policy, and social integration, demonstrating a historical continuity in the interplay between survival, adaptation, and statecraft. The Vietnam War stands as both a historical culmination and a transformative episode. It integrated lessons from centuries of resistance, colonial experience, and dynastic governance into a modern struggle with global dimensions. The endurance of Vietnamese society under conditions of extreme adversity illustrates the interplay between geography, culture, ideology, and strategic acumen. Villages, cities, and the countryside were not merely backdrops to the conflict, but active participants, shaping and sustaining the course of events. Social cohesion, historical memory, and cultural identity provided the foundation upon which military and political strategies were constructed, demonstrating that resilience is as much a social and cultural phenomenon as a military one. The international ramifications were equally significant. The Vietnam War influenced global Cold War dynamics, shaped international law and military doctrine, and affected public opinion and political policy far beyond Southeast Asia. It demonstrated the limitations of foreign intervention in conflicts characterized by deep social integration, historical consciousness, and popular mobilization. Lessons regarding asymmetrical warfare, the integration of society into resistance, and the limits of technological superiority remain central to military and political analysis today. Economically, the war devastated production, displaced populations, and disrupted trade. Yet it also accelerated adaptation, reconstruction, and innovation in the post-war era. Networks of local governance, community support, and civil infrastructure developed during the conflict became essential in rebuilding the nation. The human and material costs of the war informed policies on land reform, economic planning, and social integration in the subsequent decades, reflecting a continuity in the Vietnamese approach to resilience. Survival, adaptation, and reconstruction were inseparable from historical memory, cultural identity, and strategic foresight. The Vietnam War, therefore, was more than a military conflict. It was a crucible in which the historical, cultural, and political identity of a nation was tested and reaffirmed. The North's victory and national reunification were the result not merely of ideology or arms, but of a centuries-old tradition of resistance, governance, and social cohesion that had enabled Vietnam to endure foreign domination, internal strife, and existential threats. The war's legacy is both tragic and instructive, demonstrating the depth of Vietnamese resilience, the importance of historical consciousness, and the intricate interplay of culture, society, and strategy in shaping the destiny of a nation. The conclusion of the Vietnam War in 1975 marked the end of foreign-backed division and the reunification of Vietnam under a single government. Yet it also ushered in a period of profound economic, social, and political challenge. The nation, scarred by decades of warfare, colonial exploitation, and internal division, faced the monumental task of reconstruction while simultaneously consolidating a centralized government and navigating a rapidly changing international environment. The immediate post-war years revealed the resilience and endurance of the Vietnamese people, but also highlighted the limitations of institutional capacity, the fragility of infrastructure, and the lingering consequences of decades of disruption. From the outset, reunification presented both political and logistical complexities. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the North had operated under a centralized, socialist framework for decades, while the South had been governed under a more fragmented, externally supported system. Integrating these regions required harmonizing legal systems, administrative structures, and social hierarchies, a process fraught with both bureaucratic and cultural tension. Northern administrators were dispatched to the South to implement reforms and assert authority, yet they often encountered resistance, cultural differences, and lingering loyalty to the previous regime. Bridging these divides required not only administrative skill, but a profound understanding of social dynamics, local identity, and the historical memory of resistance and collaboration that defined the wartime experience. Economically, Vietnam faced devastation on multiple fronts. Agricultural land had been destroyed or poisoned by chemical defoliants. Infrastructure had been demolished by bombings and sabotage, and industrial capacity was minimal. The post-war economy had to simultaneously feed a population displaced by conflict, rehabilitate urban and rural centers, and rebuild productive capacity in a context of scarcity. Initially, the government pursued policies rooted in central planning, collectivization, and state control of key sectors. Large-scale land reforms, cooperative farming, and attempts at industrial organization were implemented with the dual goals of social equity and economic recovery. Yet these measures often produced unintended consequences: inefficiency, low productivity, and public dissatisfaction. The transition from war economy to peacetime production proved extraordinarily difficult, revealing the complexities inherent in rebuilding a nation whose social and economic structures had been systematically disrupted for decades. Socially, the post-war period was characterized by immense upheaval and adaptation. Millions of people had been displaced, either as refugees fleeing conflict zones or as evacuees relocated for strategic or administrative purposes. Families were separated, communities uprooted, and traditional social networks fragmented. The government implemented programs to resettle populations, rebuild villages, and restore social services. Yet the scope of need frequently exceeded capacity. Health crises, malnutrition, and lack of basic services were pervasive, necessitating both local initiative and centralized coordination. Social cohesion, while resilient, was under immense strain as the population navigated the trauma of war, displacement, and uncertainty about the future. Education and cultural reconstruction became essential components of the nation's recovery. Schools had been destroyed or repurposed during the war, and curricula in the South had been heavily influenced by Western and non-socialist ideologies. Integrating these populations required re-education programs, training of teachers, and dissemination of materials aligned with the values and objectives of the unified government. Literature, history, and civic instruction were employed to foster national identity, continuity, and loyalty, emphasizing narratives of resistance, resilience, and collective sacrifice. Cultural institutions, including theaters, museums, and historical societies, were revitalized to reinforce the continuity of Vietnamese identity across generations and regions. Externally, Vietnam faced geopolitical challenges that compounded domestic difficulties. Relations with neighboring countries, particularly China and Cambodia, were complex and often tense, influenced by both historical territorial disputes and contemporary political alignments. The Vietnamese government also contended with the broader dynamics of the Cold War, balancing the support of the Soviet Union with the strategic risks posed by Western-aligned neighbors and ongoing U.S. influence in Southeast Asia. Diplomatic efforts were critical in securing aid, managing borders, and projecting legitimacy internationally, demonstrating that post-war recovery extended beyond reconstruction to encompass complex international relations and strategic positioning. The post-war military situation remained a central concern. While the war had ended, the country's defense infrastructure had to be maintained and reorganized to protect sovereignty and stability. Former combatants were demobilized or integrated into national armed forces, military logistics were realigned to peacetime priorities, and strategic planning accounted for both historical threats and emerging regional dynamics. Military service, training, and organization became a bridge between wartime experience and post-war governance, reinforcing the role of the armed forces not only as protectors of the nation, but as participants in reconstruction, civic organization, and the social integration of veterans. Reconstruction of infrastructure was both urgent and symbolic. Bridges, roads, irrigation networks, and urban facilities had been destroyed, interrupting trade, mobility, and communication. Restoring these systems required extensive labor mobilization, technical expertise, and coordination across regions previously divided by conflict. Canal systems were repaired to support agriculture, roads were reconstructed to facilitate market access, and urban centers were rebuilt to accommodate growing populations. These efforts not only re-established economic functionality, but also reinforced the authority of the state, demonstrating its capacity to provide order, stability, and essential services in the aftermath of total war. The post-war economy relied heavily on the mobilization of human capital. Labor-intensive reconstruction projects engaged millions of citizens, integrating wartime organizational structures into peacetime initiatives. Cooperative farming, labor brigades, and communal work programs reflected both socialist principles and practical necessity, leveraging collective effort to compensate for scarce capital and technological resources. While these programs achieved varying levels of success, they underscored a central principle of post-war governance. The endurance and adaptability of the population were as critical as formal policy in shaping recovery. Political consolidation was another defining feature of this period. The government undertook extensive efforts to unify legal codes, standardize administrative procedures, and extend central authority into rural areas. Former collaborators with the South Vietnamese regime were often subject to political re-education, social sanction, or reintegration programs, illustrating the delicate balance between justice, reconciliation, and stability. Local governance structures were reorganized to ensure both compliance and participation, reinforcing the integration of historically diverse regions into a cohesive national polity. These measures demonstrated an understanding that post-war legitimacy depended as much on social cohesion and cultural continuity as on military or administrative authority. Health and social services were similarly prioritized, as decades of conflict had decimated public health infrastructure. Hospitals, clinics, and sanitation systems were restored or newly constructed, addressing both immediate humanitarian needs and long-term public welfare. Programs to combat malnutrition, infectious disease, and war-related trauma were implemented in conjunction with broader social reforms, illustrating the integration of health, social policy, and governance in post-war reconstruction. Communities, often drawing upon traditional practices and local knowledge, were mobilized to support these initiatives, reinforcing collective responsibility and social cohesion. The post-war period also highlighted the resilience of Vietnamese culture in the face of destruction. Folk traditions, religious practices, and artistic expression persisted despite disruption, providing continuity and a sense of identity. Literature, poetry, and historical narratives were employed both to document the war's consequences and to inspire reconstruction, linking collective memory with ongoing efforts to rebuild society. Cultural resilience became intertwined with political and social stability, demonstrating that identity, tradition, and memory were foundational to national endurance. By the mid-1980s, Vietnam's post-war challenges remained immense. Economic stagnation, bureaucratic inefficiency, and regional disparities continued to impede recovery. Yet the period laid essential groundwork for future reform, demonstrating the nation's capacity to endure, adapt, and sustain social cohesion despite unprecedented devastation. The integration of wartime experience into governance, reconstruction, and societal organization ensured continuity of knowledge, discipline, and resilience, preparing the stage for the transformative changes of the Doi Moi era that would follow. The post-war years, therefore, represent both a period of trial and a testament to Vietnamese perseverance. The nation had survived colonialism, decades of warfare and division, emerging as a unified polity capable of confronting immense challenges. Political consolidation, social integration, economic reconstruction, and cultural resilience were intertwined in a complex tapestry that defined the trajectory of modern Vietnam. Lessons from these years informed the policies, priorities, and strategic thinking of subsequent decades, illustrating the enduring interplay of history, culture, and governance in shaping national survival and adaptation. By 1986, Vietnam had endured centuries of dynastic shifts, foreign invasions, colonial exploitation, and devastating wars, yet the nation faced a critical juncture that would redefine its trajectory. The post-war decades had left the country struggling economically, socially, and politically. Agricultural production lagged, infrastructure remained fragile, and industrial output was insufficient to sustain the population. International isolation, exacerbated by strained relations with China and limited engagement with Western powers, further constrained opportunities for growth. The Vietnamese leadership recognized that survival alone was insufficient. The nation needed transformation, a strategy that could harness its human and cultural resources to secure economic vitality and global relevance. This realization set the stage for the Doi Moi reforms, a comprehensive program of economic liberalization, administrative restructuring, and societal adaptation that would reshape Vietnam and usher in a new era of growth and integration. The Doi Moi reforms, officially introduced at the 6th National Congress of the Communist Party of Vietnam in 1986, marked a deliberate pivot from centralized economic planning toward a socialist-oriented market economy. These reforms acknowledged the limitations of rigid state control while retaining political continuity, blending innovation with ideological pragmatism. Land reforms were central to the initiative. Collective farming was gradually dismantled, private cultivation and market mechanisms were encouraged, and incentives were introduced to increase productivity. Farmers, who had long struggled under centralized quotas and inefficiencies, were empowered to manage their own plots, sell surplus produce, and invest in local development. The transformation of rural agriculture was not merely an economic adjustment. It represented a shift in social relations, governance, and the role of the state in mediating between local autonomy and national priorities. Urban and industrial reform paralleled the transformation of rural sectors. State-owned enterprises were restructured, foreign investment was cautiously welcomed, and private entrepreneurship was gradually legalized. Industrial zones emerged in strategic locations, producing textiles, electronics, and consumer goods for both domestic consumption and export. Infrastructure development accelerated, with improvements in roads, ports, and telecommunications facilitating trade, connectivity, and integration into regional and global markets. Cities such as Ho Chi Minh City, Hanoi, and Da Nang became centers of commerce, innovation, and cultural exchange, reflecting the dynamic interplay between modernization, tradition, and governance. Education and human capital development were central to the success of Doi Moi. Recognizing that economic transformation required knowledge, skills, and innovation, the government invested in primary, secondary, and tertiary education. Curricula were reformed to include technical training, foreign languages, and modern scientific principles, while vocational schools and universities expanded access to skilled labor. These investments not only enhanced productivity, but also fostered a generation capable of navigating the challenges of globalization, technological change, and economic competition. Education became both a tool of development and a means of sustaining social cohesion, bridging historical experience with contemporary opportunity. The social dimensions of Doi Moi were equally profound. Market-oriented reforms altered patterns of consumption, mobility, and urbanization. Rural populations migrated to cities in search of employment, contributing to urban growth, social diversity, and the emergence of a dynamic labor market. Consumer culture evolved, shaped by both domestic production and exposure to international goods, media, and ideas. At the same time, the government maintained social policies aimed at equity, education, healthcare, and poverty alleviation, seeking to balance economic liberalization with social stability. The integration of economic modernization with social policy reflected a recognition that material growth alone could not ensure national cohesion or long-term stability. Politically, Doi Moi represented a careful calibration. While economic liberalization encouraged market forces and foreign engagement, political authority remained centralized under the Communist Party. This dual strategy preserved continuity, legitimacy, and social order while enabling experimentation in governance, regulation, and local autonomy. Decentralization in certain sectors allowed provinces, cities, and municipalities to adapt policies to local conditions, experiment with innovative approaches, and attract investment, while maintaining alignment with national objectives. This balance of central authority and local flexibility became a defining feature of modern Vietnamese governance, reflecting lessons learned from centuries of war, colonization, and internal conflict. The international dimension of Doi Moi was equally transformative. Vietnam sought to normalize relations with former adversaries, integrate into regional economic networks, and participate in global trade and diplomacy. Relations with the United States improved gradually, culminating in normalized diplomatic ties in 1995. Membership in regional organizations such as ASEAN facilitated trade, investment, and strategic partnerships. Vietnam's engagement with the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and other international institutions provided access to capital, technical expertise, and global markets, further accelerating economic and social transformation. Global integration became both an opportunity and a challenge, requiring adaptation to international norms, competition, and strategic negotiation. Economic outcomes of Doi Moi were dramatic. GDP growth rates surged, exports expanded, and living standards improved. Poverty declined, nutrition and healthcare access increased, and urbanization created new opportunities for employment and social mobility. Rural areas, once isolated and marginalized, benefited from investment in infrastructure, education, and market access. The combination of agricultural reform, industrial growth, and international engagement transformed Vietnam from a post-war economy on the brink of stagnation into one of the fastest-growing economies in Southeast Asia. The transformation was not instantaneous, nor was it uniform. Regional disparities persisted, and social challenges remained. Yet the trajectory of development demonstrated the capacity of Vietnam to adapt, innovate, and harness its human and cultural resources in pursuit of national prosperity. Culturally, the post-Doi Moi period witnessed both continuity and adaptation. Traditional practices, folk art, literature, and religious life continued to shape social identity, providing cohesion and resilience amid rapid change. At the same time, exposure to global media, technology, and culture influenced consumption, lifestyle, and social norms, creating a dynamic interplay between historical continuity and modern innovation. Urban youth, in particular, became agents of cultural change, blending Vietnamese traditions with global influences in fashion, music, and media. Cultural evolution was neither passive nor imposed. It was negotiated, reflecting the agency of individuals and communities in defining identity, aspiration, and social belonging. Vietnam's environmental landscape, profoundly altered by decades of war and colonization, became a focal point in the modern era. Reforestation, irrigation, and sustainable agricultural practices were introduced to restore ecosystems disrupted by chemical defoliants, deforestation, and industrialization. Water management, flood control, and urban planning reflected lessons learned from historical experience, integrating local knowledge with technical expertise. Environmental adaptation became intertwined with economic strategy, social well-being, and national resilience, demonstrating the comprehensive nature of post-Doi Moi governance. The demographic transformation of Vietnam during this period was equally significant. Population growth, rural to urban migration, and the integration of formerly isolated communities reshaped social structures, labor markets, and political representation. Policies aimed at education, health, and family planning facilitated social adaptation, while local governance structures mediated conflicts and fostered cooperation. The integration of population dynamics into economic, social, and political planning reflected an understanding that modern statecraft required coordination across multiple dimensions of national life, from grassroots community organization to international diplomacy. In the 21st century, Vietnam continues to navigate the challenges and opportunities created by Doi Moi. Economic liberalization, foreign investment, and industrialization coexist with efforts to maintain social equity, environmental sustainability, and cultural continuity. Cities thrive as centers of innovation and commerce, while rural areas balance tradition with modernization. Technological adoption, participation in global supply chains, and engagement with international institutions demonstrate Vietnam's capacity to leverage historical experience and cultural resilience in shaping a modern, globally integrated nation. At the same time, the lessons of history, resistance, adaptation, and the centrality of social cohesion remain integral to governance, policy, and national identity. Vietnam's modern history is therefore a continuum, linking centuries of dynastic rule, colonial subjugation, and war with contemporary transformation. The Doi Moi reforms exemplify the strategic integration of historical lessons, cultural identity, and pragmatic governance. They illustrate the capacity of a nation shaped by adversity to harness its human, cultural, and institutional resources for development, resilience, and global engagement. Today, Vietnam stands as a testament to centuries of endurance, a society that has survived foreign domination, internal turmoil, and war, and yet continues to adapt, innovate, and flourish on its own terms. Its modern economy, evolving social structures, and global integration are not departures from history, but extensions of a long trajectory in which resilience, strategic adaptation, and cultural continuity define the Vietnamese experience.